Alrighty, hey gang, welcome back you guys. Happy Wednesday. Hope you guys had a great week. I'm Matt and welcome to Stove Chat. It's episode 44, and if you don't know, we're here to talk about masonry stoves, masonry heaters, rocket stoves, rocket mass heaters, building them, how to build them, how not to build them, all that stuff. And I got a website, walkerstoves.com. You can I think it's listed in the description down there, and on that site I sell plans for masonry cook stoves, rocket stoves, things like that, and try and show up here on a regular basis to provide a resource for you guys to come ask questions, help you with your builds, bounce your ideas off of other builders. We got a great crew here, so thanks for being here, everybody. Nice to see the gangs all here. Really appreciate all you guys hanging out with me today. Really awesome to have you here. Always learning, Belgian Gulch. Fred, thank you for that. Really appreciate it, my friend. Mark, nice to see you as always. Two Trance, glad you're here, man. Thanks for being here, you guys. So, like I said, hope you guys had a great week. I've had a really good one. I am excited for today's show. I got some great stuff to go over. I got some great questions. I've had some great interactions. That's a lot of greats. But I've had some really good emails this week and some great interactions. Things are starting to really cook out there. You know, people are definitely trying to get their builds moving along as we head through the summer here. So really appreciate you guys and really appreciate all that. So yeah, Cletus, Robin, thanks for being here. Let's see what to start with. I think I have to apologize. I just went and did my errands this morning, ran to the dump and went to the garden store and got some peat moss, and I just barely made it back in time. So usually I write down a bunch of notes. I didn't do that today, but what I did do actually though is I spent some time yesterday getting some stuff together for today, because I had some stuff I really wanted to go over actually last year, even when we started this. There's been a show that I've wanted to do for a while, so I think we'll do it today. But we'll start with a few questions. So one of the first questions I got was from Dan, Positive Aspect in Australia. And Dan, thanks so much for your support through all this time, and for your great questions and interaction. Really appreciate it. So you guys might remember Dan. We looked at one of his builds last year. He had that really cool big open bench with the nicely sloped back, and does really cool work. But Dan has a great question here, and he also makes a suggestion, which I'll get into in a few moments. But let's start with his question. He's talking about the density of materials, and he's asking me, I'm just going to paraphrase because he's got a lot written here. Well, let's see. He's mostly talking about using what he calls crusher dust or metal dust. That's Australian, and it's a basalt basalt particles, basically. It sounds like it's probably some kind of mine tailings or some kind of processed stuff. So he's got some basalt sand, essentially, and he's wondering if he could use that to build bricks that are more dense. So he's done some calculations. He says it looks like it's going to come out 30% heavier than a clay sand brick, and he wonders if that's a good idea. And so really this is kind of a two-parter question. One is that an appropriate material? But more, and really what I'd like to address, is the larger question of the density of the materials that you're using. So let's just start with the broad view here in terms of density. So what he's really asking is, red bricks are a certain density. Is it okay if we make bricks that are higher density than those and use those sort of interchangeably? And you know, my feeling with regards to this is that the more density you can get, the more mass in space, in a certain amount of space, the more thermal storage you have, and the longer your heating cycles will be for a given amount of space. So volume is what we should really be talking about. So like say your stove is, you have X amount of volume of dense solid material in there minus the airspace, right? And it weighs so much. Well, if you have the same volume of material and it weighs 30% more, you obviously have 30% more thermal storage. You're going to get longer heat cycles. So it's really the discussion that we talk about a lot with regards to how much mass is appropriate for a stove. And it's kind of like how long is a piece of string, right? and we've covered this a lot. People talk about ways you can calculate stove size and pair it to the mass. But as you guys know, my philosophy on that is really one of flexibility and learning for each individual, individualized, personalized tuning of each stove based on the owner-operator's experience. In other words, I don't think that, you can use calculations to get yourself a nice midpoint, and in my plans, I do use plans that are sized such that they guarantee good performance for most people in most situations. But everyone's going to have different needs. Some people are going to want to burn once hot and fast, and then they're gone and they want it to stay warm for a long time. Other people want to stay home and have a fire all day. Some people have warm climates and just need a little heat. Some people are in cold climates or poorly insulated homes, need a lot of heat. Some people have small spaces, big spaces, blah, 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 on and on and on. So, this kind of brings the whole thing back around to the mass question, and the question, is more mass better? And I think that for most folks, the most mass you can get in a certain amount of volume is probably almost always going to be the best choice. Now, there are going to be exceptions to that. People who are wanting like a 50-foot long bench to take up the whole length of a wall and seat a bunch of people. So they really want more seating, and they want long, hot areas where you can't, use really high mass at the front of that because you'll never get the far end cool. So you'd want to adjust things to push the heat farther down, allow it to travel. But so there's situations where higher mass isn't always better. But for the most part, I feel like for thermal storage, since we're building masonry heaters that, are mass heaters, you're typically going to want the most mass for any given volume. So the heavier the bricks, typically the better. Now, we can get really into the weeds with that if we want to, and recognize that there's more to the heat storage and the thermal radiation characteristics and other minutia, I will say, that will affect your choices. For instance, soapstone is really the premier thermal storage masonry material because it's really dense, so it's heavy, it's high mass for its space. But not only that, it has really interesting thermal storage and emissivity characteristics. Emissivity being the amount of I believe it's infrared radiation. I could have that wrong, but that a surface can emit, and it depends on the surface and the material. And then there is also, and I forget the word, but there's also the thermal storage capabilities of these materials. So materials that have similar densities can have varying thermal storage capacity, and soapstone happens to have phenomenal thermal storage capacity. So there's subtle variations there, and you can really drive yourself crazy, I think, using charts to try and evaluate that. What it really comes down to is do the best you can with what you have. I think, personally, that's really the best choice. Make your stove as heavy as you can in a given volume within reason. And what's reasonable to you might not be reasonable for another. So many folks, it's fine to spend $10,000 on a soapstone cladding for their stove. It's beautiful, it's heavy, it provides excellent thermal storage, it radiates heat in a really nice way, has soft, warm heat, it has all these lovely features, but it's really expensive, right? So for some people, that's not a good choice at all, which is why we go for my plans, I start with the 44-cent brick from Home Depot because it's something that's available to most people and a pretty good middle of the road. It's heavier and more dense than cob, but of course it's not as heavy or dense as soapstone, but somewhere in the middle. So with that said, obviously this is a subject you can go really deep into, and there's a lot of details you can cover and variables that you can go into. But for the most part, I would say that yes, if you can use heavier bricks, higher density materials, use them where you can. So let me catch up with chat here, because we're getting some good comments there. So Permaculture Playground, glad you're here. Thanks for being here. And Finbear, nice to see you. Finbear says we have huge soapstone mine here in Finland, and that's where they make the tulikivi. And yeah, that's a great example. All of those top end commercial masonry heaters like Tula Kiwi are typically going to incorporate a lot of soapstone. Typically, they're going to be found in places where there is a lot of soapstone, because obviously shipping things like soapstone doesn't make a whole lot of financial sense. So a similar situation, Finbear, is on the east coast of the United States. Soapstone there is quarried there or mined there in a lot of the places in the Northeast, and it's relatively common, and so it's used often for heaters there. However, out here on the West Coast, the only places where you'll see it are in the most premier builds, where money was really no object, because as far as I know, there's nowhere closer than the East Coast that it comes from. I'm probably wrong. There's probably somewhere. But I have priced it here in Seattle anyways, and it's unbelievably expensive. And then Belgian Gulch says to Finn, maybe they have a bent and dent pile, which is something actually that I did look into at the soapstone resellers here, because they do custom countertops, and they have a big facility, so they're cutting and grinding and things like that, and I was interested in their offcuts. They do sell offcuts, but what I was really interested to find out is that what they don't do is sell the fines from the milling, because they use that to, I think they probably resell it, but it's used to make those fake countertops and things like that, where they incorporate it with a composite, usually a resin. It's the same way they make like fake turquoise and things like that, is they can use those rock fines nowadays and incorporate them with epoxies and make something that's somewhere in between rock and plastic. And it has a lot of value. So Finbear says, I guess soapstone doesn't hold the temperatures inside the riser. Finbear, it's not like it would melt. It will definitely stand up to those temperatures, and in terms of the material itself, like not melting or changing form. But what's a problem for really any stone in the riser is the really quick cycling, where you light the fire, and this part right in the bottom of the riser is going to see like 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe even 1,000 degrees Celsius, within a couple minutes, while the backside of it is still cold. And so that just causes stone to break. It's that difference in temperature across its surface that really messes it up. So I don't think there's any natural masonry material you can really put inside, to use inside your core that won't be sort of torn apart by the rapid cycling from hot to cold and the difference in temperature across its body, as it were. So Cletus says, as an aside, how many cubic feet was your sauna, and was the 6-inch J-tube sufficient to reach temps around 190 Fahrenheit inside the sauna? Cletus, the sauna is probably about 3 feet wide by 6 feet long, maybe a little bit. It's probably roughly that. It's probably like maybe a little more than 3 feet wide, maybe a little less than 6 feet long. So, and a short, pretty low ceiling, like an 8-foot ceiling. I don't know that I doubt I ever got it to 190 in there. It's pretty much, it's totally uninsulated. It's just like, and there's big gaps at the top and at the corners. I mean, it's really crappily built. It was mostly a shower stall for me, an outdoor shower. And I put the sauna there because I needed something to do with that core to show you guys, to build something in the video, and I was curious about doing it. It does work. It's actually really neat. But I mean, the stove and the installation, all that's, I totally vouch for it. But what isn't good is my sauna, the building around it. So I never was able to get it to 190. I didn't really ever try, but I did have heated it up in there to where like I'm sweating, and I, even in the winter when it's like 30 degrees outside, I can get it up to well over 100 degrees in there. I'm pretty sure that if you insulated it and it was a well-built enclosure, that 6-inch J-tube with a radiator would cook you right out of there. I don't think there's any question that you could get it up to 190. The question is, how long would it take, right? But if you had good insulation, I don't think there's any question that it would have more than enough power. And I used very little wood even to do that. So I get a lot of questions on that sauna. I kind of regret that I didn't take more time, build it better, but I do hope to do that in the future. And to be honest with you, it wasn't really something that I cobbled that together with stuff that was laying around here. I wasn't in a position to go invest in building a proper fine sauna with insulation and fine joints and things like that. So there you go. So let's get caught back up with chat here. So Always Learning says, I like the high thermal storage value of water. You can plumb it where you want your heat and drain it, store it elsewhere in an insulated vessel until needed, and cool it off at your leisure. And Oregon Coast Green Man says, differential thermal expansion in a brittle solid, difference between surface and subsequent layers. And Oregon Coast Green Man, that's exactly right. And he's doing a little deep dive into why, I was talking about why though, the brittle solid materials like soapstone or any sort of natural stone won't really hold up inside the riser. And that's a really good technical explanation. Oregon Coast Green Man, it's the differential thermal expansion in the brittle solid, and the difference between the layers really within it, and how those temperature differences rise so fast. So let's see. Let me caught up. I know I'm scattered all over, but you guys are chatting. It's great. I love it. So Finbear says, so the core material, the heat-resistant brick, is the best or only option. Well, Finbear, not really. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I really love the ceramic fiberboard insulation inside. While it is susceptible to abrasion, it is totally impermeable to that type of thermal stress that we're talking about. And so, I sort of tend to think that like softer materials, because they're so durable to thermal stresses and cycling, I really like them. And they also offer some performance advantages being highly insulated. So things like ceramic fiberboard, insulated kiln brick, insulating kiln brick, or sometimes called insulating firebrick, which are really light, significantly different than other firebrick. Those are great choices. But inside the core, if you need heavy, hard masonry, then firebrick are really your best choice. But that isn't to say that they don't also suffer the same fate. They are still, as Oregon Coast Green Man called it, a brittle solid. A brick is still a brittle solid. So unfortunately, they actually do still crack from that thermal expansion. It just tends to not be catastrophic because they're fit together, and a little split in them doesn't really matter because things can't move out of place. Now, the reason they do a pretty good job of tolerating it is because they're made up of a homogenized mixture of lots of little parts, right? So each little part can kind of go through its own little thermal expansion within the substrate of the larger piece. So they tend to perform better than, say, a rock, a natural stone in there. But because they're brittle, they still will experience big differences in temperatures between the layers, and eventually they still do crack. Not all of them, but this is something that we go over all the time. People will say, I want to build a firebrick core because I just want it to be bomb-proof, and we have to come back and tell them, hey, your firebrick core is going to crack. It's probably not going to be a major issue, but don't expect that your firebricks aren't going to crack. And if you build it in such a way that they aren't sort of captured by the structure of the stacking, in other words, if they're in a place where a crack would let them fall, like a traditional J-tube often has bricks across the burn tunnel roof, and they will, after just a couple seasons, you'll see people having to dig in there and replace them. I don't think it's a big deal. It's just that kind of part of the game of burning really high temperatures. And I would even say, even my old box stove from 1960 or whatever that came with my house has fire bricks on the inside, and they're all cracked and broken. So that's just how it goes. So let's see. Let's catch up here. So Eric Martin's great question. He says, your smaller cook stove with the heat bench, is there a size limit to the heat bench? And Eric, it's a great question. It's something that we talk about a lot in here, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier. And in my opinion, the answer really is no, within reason. Now, of course, there's a size limit. And the limit is, really dictated by, let's see, how do I put this? Basically, you just need to retain enough heat in the chimney gases to continue to provide draft. Now, if your stove's routing goes through the bench and then comes back to the chimney, and your bench is huge, that bench is going to suck all the heat out of your chimney gases. you won't get any draft and the whole thing will plug up and start smoking out the front door. So we overcome that in my designs by using a bypass that allows you to go right from the firebox, route the gases into the chimney, and provide draft. Now, if you have that bypass, you can manipulate it in varying degrees such that you are actually able to pull heat through a bench. And so in that way, you really have a lot of flexibility in how large that bench can be. So it isn't to say it can be, limitless, but you can almost build it limitless and then use the bypass to control how you heat it. Now, if you build it too big, you'll never really be able to shut the bypass. You'll never really be able to get that bench hot. But you can certainly build it to a size and play with it through a season and see what works for you. Now, for everyone, it's different for everybody. Some people, like I said, live in a warm area and they want to burn once a day, but they would like heat to get to the bench. Other people live in cold areas and they're going to burn for 14 hours a day, so they're going to be able to get away with a much larger bench because they're going to be able to manipulate that, and as that bench heats up, they can manipulate it a different way and get heat farther down the bench, and eventually they're going to have the whole bench warm, and then they're also going to have from that a longer heat cycle when the stove's off. So their burning cycles are very different depending on where you are, how you use the stove, and how long the bench is. So with that said, you can really adjust the bench to your goals, and you can adjust your burning style to meet whatever that bench dictates. So I like to let people know that there's a lot of flexibility. I think the best thing to do is to build it how you want it first, and then tune the stove to accomplish that as you go through the season, and then you can evaluate, whether that's appropriate for you moving forward and make some changes if need be. Oh wow, you guys are chatting it up. I'm way behind. So let's see. Let me get caught up here. Let's see. So Finbear says, in the sauna, the key is to have seating high off the floor level. Agree with that, Finbear. There's a lot of ways to approach it. You could have no insulation, like a room like mine, and just sit yourself right over the stove, sit up high, put the stove down low. There's a lot of ways to take care of that. And I will probably revisit the sauna at some point in the future and try and get myself a real facility that I can use. Oregon Coast Green Man says, I'm building an insulated masonry bell with open top tanks in it to be powered by Matt's super hot batch box core. I love that, Oregon Coast Green Man. I think that's really, really a cool way to do it. You get the benefit of that thermal storage of the water. You get a lot of opportunity to use it in different ways, and the open top tanks give a lot of safety. It's kind of like an old wetback system on an old big kitchen cook stove from the pioneer days, and I think that's a really neat way to go. And then Always Learning says you really need a variety of thermal mass components you can channel and choose as needed, and that's exactly right. Always Learning, they all have different characteristics and different properties, and depending on the goals of which location of your stove you're going to, you could use them strategically. So Finbear says, I'll go and measure mine, talking about to the sauna, I imagine, saying, trust me, leaks here and there are not an issue, even a tent is enough. Yeah, right. That's kind of what I was my original intention when I built that thing, was it's going to get warm enough for me, and it does. But like I said, I haven't really cranked it up and gone and tried to cook myself out of there. And another part of that is I have a fire right here, and when it actually is cold outside, I'll look at building a fire out in the sauna, and I'll be like, I got one here, and I'll just make it 90 in here instead. So let's see. Two Trance says Firebrick, castable refractory, or ceramic fiberboard are great choices for the core. I neglected to mention castable refractory when I was talking about it. Thank you for bringing that up, Two Trance. And one of the neat things about castable refractory, you guys, and this will bring us nicely all the way back around to Dan's question from the beginning, is that with castable refractory, you can really achieve sort of anything in the spectrum of density. You can add basalt sand or things like that to make super dense, heavy thermal storage bricks. You can add perlite or buy insulated castable and make really low density castable for insulated areas. So that's a neat way to go, but you guys who've been with me for a long time know we've been all the way down that road, and while I still strongly believe in castables as a good way to build a stove, personally I've just found the ceramic fiberboard to be my choice for most of the reasons of convenience and ease of build and affordability and all of that. The cast board factory is really a pretty involved build, and yeah, we can talk about castables at some point in detail whenever it's time. But that was really my initial foray into really trying to push the boundaries of rocket stove development. I went deep with castables. As a matter of fact, I think I still have some bags and some buckets down in my shop, and I built a lot of cores with it, and it does work well. So, but as I said, I've come back around, and actually we've got David Swanson here, who is a great example of someone who's also experimented with both, and I think David, you've mentioned to me a few times that you would definitely prefer the ceramic fiberboard for most builds, for most reasons. There are places where the castables really, really useful, and for some folks' builds it's going to be the right choice. If they just want to go whole hog, it's a good way to go. That isn't to say it represents a significant quality upgrade. It's just different. So anyways, let me catch back up with chat. Let's see. Oregon Coast Green Man is talking about water heating. Copper coil submerged for preheat of domestic hot water, and a heated tank water pumped to radiators and hydronic warm floor loops. So this is a huge topic, and Oregon Coast Green Man, I love your brain. You seem to come to sort of the logical end of the road in such a concise way. So while I sit here and talk for an hour, you kind of summed it up quickly. But one of the big topics that we can get embroiled in here is heating water and what's the best way to do it. And there's a lot of options. But Oregon Coast Green Man really just summed up, in my opinion, what are, I think, really good goals to shoot for most folks with hot water ideals. And that is one of, he's going to put his tanks on top of the bell. Doesn't matter where they are, but I love that they're on top of the bell. But even if they were outside or in your attic or whatever, the idea of a separate tank, often called a buffer tank, is, I think, a really, really important one. You'll notice that in my boiler, I did the same thing. Mine sits right over the core, is just the reservoir, the buffer tank. And the buffer tank gets heated, and it gets the hot water from the fire, whether you use a copper coil, whether you use direct contact to heat your buffer tank. The goal is to create a tank full of hot water. And once you have that tank full of hot water, you can now use a coil through that hot water, like I did in my boiler, to provide your domestic hot water. And in that way, you're never heating the water you use. You can have a closed domestic hot water system, so you can retain potable water. And there's a lot of advantages to it. And then you can pump things to radiators, pump things to showers. You can use the reserve tank, as he says, to go to radiators. So there's a lot of ways to go, a lot of detail to get into. But really, when we talk about a water system, a buffer tank with a copper coil submerged for preheat of domestic hot water, and the heated tank water is pumped to radiators. In other words, those just make your buffer tank kind of bigger in a way. Your radiators, you're expanding the capacity of your system. And while they're radiating it into the room, you can open and close them. But when your thing's circulating and you're running the fire, running heat into it, all that is hopefully heating up, adding to your thermal storage. So really great way to go. Oregon Coast Green Man, really love that summary, and I'm sure that we probably just confused a lot of people, but it's at some point we'll come back to that topic and maybe address it really in depth, but that's a good one. So Finn Bear giving us some measurements on his sauna. So he says his seat is 115 centimeters from the floor level and roof height is 244. So he's got his benches halfway up the wall, roughly. And, and so getting those benches up high, putting your heat down low is a really good way to keep yourself warm in there. And so let's see, we were talking about Firebrick's cracking, and David added in a tip that he's given to us a few times now. And David, I want to say thank you for that. You're the first one I've ever heard recommend that, although I've seen it recommended often in wood stove forms for people patching their stoves. But here in the masonry stove form, I've never heard of people patching their bricks, and I really think it's a great idea. And so thanks for adding that to our, community knowledge base that that if you do have cracked fire bricks and you want them to seal, you can use some Permatex muffler and tailpipe sealer and patch that up. So great info. So the guys are talking about benches for the sauna. You could put a step stool or a lower bench for your feet in there. And Finbear says we have the highest seat against the wall. Excuse me. The highest seat against the wall, and then step out towards the heat for the second seat, and it's still too high to sit, which is where the step stool comes in. So enough sauna talk. I love the sauna talk. Like I said, I think saunas are one of the great uses of rocket mass heaters, and I just actually had a great sauna conversation with a customer this week. So yeah, I'm just gonna do that again to you. I apologize. So let's see. Finbear says, do you have videos where you use the board? I do. I believe you're asking about the ceramic fiber board, and if you, I think it's called. It's the one where I build the sauna, but I think it's building a ceramic fiberboard core, but I do have a video there where I show you how I built my core with the board. And Cletus says, I'm obsessed with this sauna. I like the stool idea. I'll set the lower bench with respects to the upper bench and use the stool. That's awesome, Cletus. I think that's going to be a really cool. So here's David. This is David Swanson. Finbear, you should really pay attention to what David says. David says, since we're looking for core materials, David's done both castable and CFB, building a riserless core, and he says they both work great, and they do both perform great. And one of the things that David mentioned when he built the castable versus the CFB was just the weight and carrying, trying to move the thing. You're not going to move the cast one, whereas the ceramic fiberboard one you can pick up and move around. Now, for a lot of people, that's not an issue, but I think it does illustrate how much mass you put into the core when you build one out of castable. And in some situations, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So in things like my brick oven barbecue, I choose a high mass core because I sort of want the long heat cycle and a little bit more stable temps and things like that. So they both work great. So there you go. So Finbear says, do you think a pool heater would be a feasible idea? Not only do I think it'd be a feasible idea, but we actually have one in operation. So I have a great customer in the UK who has an outdoor pool, and I believe he just finished this year. I'm trying to remember. He's emailed me quite a few times with updates, and I think most of them were within the last 6 months. So I think he finished the stove sort of this winter, but he built a tiny stove outdoors specific. I think he built the tiny. Maybe it was the boiler. No, I think he built the boiler. Excuse me. He built the Walker boiler specifically as a pool heater, and he has emailed me over the moon. I mean, just ecstatic. And that was back in like May. I haven't heard from him this summer. But he was, at the time, he was saying, when the swimming season comes, we only need 15 degrees or whatever it was, and I'm going to get my Fahrenheits and Celsiuses confused because he was emailing me Celsius. But he, his basic point was he only needs a very small delta T, like a very small difference in temperature between what the pool kind of naturally hangs at and what he'd like it to be. So it's kind of similar to how it would be here for me. Summertime in the Pacific Northwest, it's like 70 outside, mostly during the days, and nighttime temps are 50s, low 50s. It's actually been in the 40s these last few nights. But so the pool tends to stay, if you had a swimming pool and it was sort of natural, it would be like 60-some degrees probably as it stabilized on its own without heat. So it's not that hard to get it from there to 75 or whatever it is that pool temperatures are. I don't really know now that I think about it. But anyways, yes, absolutely, you can use a Walker boiler or even a Walker tiny stove to heat a pool. Well, as a matter of fact, I have another customer in the UK that's why I got confused, because I do have another customer from probably 3 years ago who built a tiny with this one was not solely for heating the pool, but it had outdoor cooking, and it did have as accessory feature a heating coil that heated the pool. And again, that they had the same experience. They didn't need a ton of heat, and the Walker tiny stove was enough to make the difference and make the pool usable in the summer without having to have a lot of electricity inputs or something like that. So yeah, Finbear, pool heater is absolutely feasible. Now, are you going to be able to like keep it hot in the winter in Finland outdoors? Probably not. But you can make a difference. And Oregon Coast Green Man says a pool is a lot of water to heat, could take days of burning. And that's right. That's one thing that I want to point out. And that's what, like I just said about winter. A pool is a huge amount of water. If you can get it up to temp or close to, and then slowly increase it, it's very difficult for it to change much from there. And so that's why I think my customer in England with the boiler is having such success, because like I said, he starts at 65. He might get it to 66 or 67 over the course of a few hours the next day. Well, it probably doesn't change much overnight, and then he can get 70, 68, 69. I don't really know how he was doing it. Don't have direct results from how long it took or whatever. But the mass works for you and against you in those situations. And really the point of that is, if you were like in 30-degree outdoor temperatures trying to get a pool up to 80, you'd never do it with a tiny rocket stove. But certainly to add some heat, you can do it without too much difficulty. So there you go. So let's see. These guys are now talking about the Permatex on the bricks. And David Swanson says the brick is dry and the Permatex doesn't stick well until there's just a little moisture on the edge of the brick. So if you just moisten it a little bit with a moistened patch, then it'll work well and hold together. So very good tips, you guys. Thanks so much for all of the awesome comments. So Finbear's saying, I'm turning more and more towards making a Gene Payne style compost heater for the pool. I have the space and noisy neighbor, both of which was solved by a good 5-meter cubed wood chip pile. So an Oregon Coast Greenman says, get a twofer. I have experience with the Gene Payne Finbear, and it's really cool in the right situation. So when was it? I think it was 2015 when I was out at Paul Wheaton's for a while. We were doing some workshops, and he at the time had a lot of people there, so he had a lot of labor, and he had some machinery, so he had access to being able to make some pretty big mounds of stuff. And so outside of his little shower house, he had a Gene Payne style heater. And Gene Payne, for those that you don't know, is really just coiling, usually black water pipe inside your compost pile to gain water heating through the natural composting action. Now, the one thing I'll say about it is it does, like you said, 5 cubic meters. It takes an enormous pile to really make a difference in this. But what I will say about that was I was pretty impressed with it. It was fall, so it was almost freezing temperatures at night, but sunny and warm during the day. And yet you could wake up in the morning and the coil wasn't enormous, so there was maybe, however many gallons in there. But if you were the first one to it in the morning and you got sort of the water that was sitting in the compost all night, it was hot. It worked really well. Now, it didn't work well for high volume, obviously, because the compost isn't so high temp that you can just run water through it and it gets hot out the other end. The water kind of has to set there. But it was real cool. So and Finbear says, I work at a sawmill, so he's good for the wood chips. Well, there you go. That's really where I was going with that, was as long as you have material and you have the ability to handle the material. And that was really the big part of what I saw, was not only do you need to be able to, and I think you really have to have machines. I don't think you can do it in any sort of usable scale with human power, because you have to make these giant piles and then you have to tear them back down and turn them and keep them going. So really interesting, though. I love that I love that technology. So anyways, good stuff, you guys. So let's go to this other question, which sort of opens up another discussion. And I'm not sure if we'll get into this whole discussion. I kind of worked up a whole thing, but it could take a whole show, so maybe I'll wait for another show. But we'll see where we go. But first of all, let's just address this question. This is a question I get a lot, and I think you guys will appreciate this one. And it's, there's really such a simple answer. But the question is, and this was from an email this week, and again, I'll paraphrase. But basically he says, I've been watching your show, and one thing I'm not clear on is is your stove a masonry stove or a rocket stove? And so Finbear says, I've shoveled a lot of sawdust. All right, well, I didn't mean to disparage you, Finbear. You can do it without a machine. It's true, you can make some big piles with a transfer shovel and a will. So I believe you. Appreciate the laughs, man. I think that's really funny. They do need to be big piles. It sounds like you know better than me, so I'll just zip it about that. So at any rate, are these stoves masonry stoves or rocket stoves? And of course, you guys know the answer. But it was fun to think about how to explain this to someone who really doesn't have much of a background in this stuff. And of course, we all know, I think, that the answer is, well, it's both, right? It's a masonry stove. It's a masonry stove because we're using a quick hot fire to heat thermal mass, in this case masonry, for later release. So we have thermal storage, quick hot fire in the interest of burning clean and efficiently, and thermal storage for the interest of long, even heating cycles. That's essentially what a masonry stove is. Masonry stoves typically have fireboxes on the front end that do burn hot and fast, but that doesn't mean they were all rocket stoves, because a rocket stove really is a pretty specific thing too, right? It has a certain set of parameters that provide passive draft and a passive blower type combustion is what I call it. Air moving rapidly through a turbulent zone to create turbulence in an area where there's high temperature for a certain amount of time, and you get that rocket type combustion. Now that's very different than just big fireboxes and a lot of masonry stoves that kind of just burn straight upwards, and then they just kind of run those hot gases through chimneys. Those are masonry stoves that have a firebox in front, but they don't really have a rocket stove component. So what I say to someone who says, is it a masonry stove or a rocket stove? I say it's both. It's a masonry stove using rocket combustion principles, rocket stove combustion principles. Now, one of the things that trips people up is that a lot of the rocket stoves that they see, as a matter of fact, most people's experiences with rocket stoves is like a 3-inch or 2-inch little K, the world's crappiest shape for a rocket stove, but all the metal ones seem to come that way. So all these guys building, rocket stoves out of metal tubing, which I did too, my very first one. I'm not picking on these people, but it's just sort of my first rocket stove, right? You find some square tubing or round tubing and you weld them together and you fire sheets out the top, and it's really cool. So most folks, that's what they think of when they think of rocket stove. So when they see something that looks like a firebox and I load real pieces of firewood in it, that was another part of this question, or this customer's question, when he said, is it a masonry stove or rocket stove? You seem to be putting in a lot of wood compared to the rocket stoves I've seen where they burn twigs. And so then I have to kind of go a little ways down the system size discussion, because obviously a stove that's designed for a 6-inch chimney is really different than the little cooking stoves and the Lorena stoves and the stoves that typically have risers of like 2 or 3-inch diameter, and they put a pot on top and boil their water or whatever, and they use twigs, and that is a rocket stove, but it's very different than what we're using here. So that kind of brings us all the way around though to, okay, so they're masonry stoves. How are they different from the other masonry stoves? Well, we use rocket stove combustion, which is fairly modern. There's obviously older examples of it, but it's been refined in the last few decades to reach a level of combustion efficiency that really previously is fairly unknown in passive burning systems. That isn't saying no one's ever done it before. I think rocket stoves have probably been invented throughout the millennia over and over again. The Dakota fire pit's a good example. But for the most part, humans are kind of dumb, and we end up at a place in time, like in the 1800s, when Ben Franklin can put fire in a metal box, and people think, that the Franklin stove is some amazing piece of modern technology. Obviously I don't feel that way. It's like it's really, really horrible combustion, and I think we've done better at other times in history. But nonetheless, in the modern world, the rocket stove combustion core does represent a fairly modern departure in terms of combustion efficiency from traditional wood-burning fireboxes. And so most traditional masonry stoves, masonry heaters, have pretty poor efficiency with regards to their front end fireboxes. Now, one thing you'll see is that the proponents of masonry stoves traditionally would say we can harvest 90% of the heat created by the fire. So they talk about efficiency in the 90 percentages, but they're only talking about heat created and heat saved. Whereas with rocket stoves, when we say 90%, we're talking about potential heat within the fuel. Very different ways of measuring, right? Where the original masonry stoves, they didn't worry too much about how efficiently the wood burned. They worried about how efficiently they used the heat that was made from burning. And often those fires were terribly smoky and inefficient fires, but they used the heat very efficiently. So there's, hopefully that illustrates a little bit that what we're doing now is we're burning the combustion core with much higher efficiency and much more cleanliness. We're running much less smoke and creosote through the stoves, putting much less particulate in the air, so we can achieve much higher efficiencies than a masonry stove of 100 years ago or whatever. Now, is that to say the rocket stove cores are the only efficient ones? It's not. There have been other people making advances in combustion, and there are some pretty neat masonry stove combustion cores out there that don't really qualify as rockets, but still achieve pretty incredible efficiency numbers. Unfortunately, most of them are really incredibly complex to build. The EcoBox, which is Richard Ussel's Eco Firebox, I think it's an ASTM recognized efficient. I'm gonna get my certifications wrong, but it's a European certified, super high efficiency masonry stove firebox. Really neat firebox, but beyond what we could even probably convey to people to build with plans. Really specific air slotting in lots of locations, and just pretty complex. So at any rate, our stoves are rocket stoves and masonry heaters, and in my opinion, they are the most modern version of masonry heaters because they feature an incredibly modern combustion core. So hopefully that answers that question, gives us a pretty good start. So one of the things I want to do, and I think maybe we'll skip it today, and maybe we'll do this next time, but I want to go a little bit deeper dive into the history of masonry heaters and where they came from, what technologies have persisted, what are some common themes from different parts of the world. From these masonry heaters have shown up sort of all over the globe at all different times in history, in all different cultures. And there are some persistent themes, and then there are some some interesting approaches. Some I think are poor, and some really, really unique ones, and some that have stood the test of time, and some that haven't. So it'll be fun to look into that. So we'll cover that, I think, a little bit next time. But I think probably one of the main things I wanted to go over, just to kind of set the tone for that and to go back to my last discussion, was the definition of a masonry heater. So it's something that we probably should all know anyways. So ASTM, the certification certifying body, defines a masonry heater in its international language as, quote, a vented heating system of predominantly masonry construction having a mass of at least 800 kilograms, 1,700 pounds, 1,760 pounds, excluding the chimney and masonry heater base. So the weight of 800 kilograms excluding the chimney and base. In particular, a masonry heater is designed specifically to capture and store a substantial portion of the heat energy from a solid fuel fire in the mass of the masonry heater through internal heat exchange flue channels, enabling a charge of solid fuel mixed with an adequate amount of air to burn rapidly and more completely at high temperatures in order to reduce emission of unburned hydrocarbons and be constructed of sufficient mass and surface area such that under normal operating conditions, the external surface temperatures of the masonry heater except in the region immediately surrounding the fuel loading doors, does not exceed 110 Celsius or 230 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty detailed definition. You can kind of break it down into vented heating system for solid fuel, having a mass of 800 kilograms, designed to burn rapidly and store heat for longer cycles, and the skin doesn't get over 230 degrees, something like that. So I thought that was really interesting, because really, our rocket stove powered masonry heaters fit that definition to a T, and I would even say they are even, more so. We've been more concerned with this part: charged solid fuel mixed with adequate amount of air to burn rapidly and more completely at high temperatures in order to reduce emission of unburned hydrocarbons. That's, really been the prime focus of the rocket stove, rocket mass heater movement. Whereas with masonry heaters, some builders, I will absolutely, give credit where credit's due. Many, especially modern builders, that is one of their prime goals. But traditionally it wasn't. And when we look at the history of masonry heaters, we'll see that. There are masonry heaters throughout history where people sometimes thought that, like, burning hay, slow, small, smoky fires were best, because it would heat the space in the masonry slowly. And actually, one of my favorite masonry heaters is the I forget what it's called now, but the Civil War tent heater, the Crimean oven, as they referred to it. And again, they did try to, it seems like, have pretty hot fires, but most of them were fairly smoky as well. Just like there's a Spanish version called the Gloria of underfloor heating, and same thing. So let me catch back up with you guys in chat and see how we're doing here. So Oregon Coast Green Man, I love that. He says, "Is your stove a masonry stove or a rocket stove?" It's kind of like asking someone if their vehicle's a Toyota or a car. And it's true, Oregon Coast Green Man, and I laugh, but we've got to understand, of course, that so many folks are coming from someplace where maybe they've never lived with a wood stove at all, let alone the fact that so many folks, this is going to be their first introduction to a masonry heater or a rocket stove. They're kind of just scratching the surface. So I can understand the confusion. You'd be surprised. It's a question I get a lot, actually. This fellow articulated it very clearly, but I do get it quite often. They say, I was looking at your stove. I often get it in this format. They'll say, "I really love your stove. I was checking it out. Can you tell me how it's better than a masonry heater? I also like those." I get that a lot. I mean, you'd be surprised, like a lot. And so I do think that that it's important for us to have this conversation, to start sort of being aware that to the outside world it's not totally clear, so we can sort of clarify our dialogue. And I think that this is really important, that we understand the definition of a masonry heater, and we can let people know, like, a masonry heater is just a big, a fire in a big mass of bricks, and we just happen to have really good fires, being that they're rocket fires, but it's still a masonry heater. So anyways, that's good stuff. So David Swanson says, "My current experiment is to use ceramic fiber blanket with a rigidizer and should have pictures by next week." And man, you guys, I gotta tell you, I don't know if I deleted the whole website. I think I did. Let's see if I can still find it. I can get it back up. I just put a little glitch in the website. No, it's still there. Okay. So David Swanson, I'm going to suggest that you go to my old forum from years and years ago that is now dead and long gone. You can't join it. I've got it kind of pretty well shut down. But it was my old permaculture forum called Permsteading, Permsteading. And there was a fella there in probably 2013 or 14 or something like that, but almost 10 years ago. And he was doing the same things. And he was building entire stoves out of fiber blanket with rigidizer. And what he was doing is he was using construction mesh. I don't know if he was using hog panels. Might have been hog panels, but I think it was actually just, really heavy duty wire mesh to make the form for the core. You get me, David? So he would build like a construction mesh cage, and then he would use the ceramic wool to line that. He could fasten it to the cage and then rigidize it. And he was building complete working rocket stoves out of that material. And it was when we were just starting to. I was still building my refractory cores. I was just starting to play with insulated. I was just starting to have the inkling of highly insulated cores. And some of these folks who were following along on, we had a little community going as I was seeking something kind of like what we've got here in the old days. And we had some members that were experimenting with low mass cores, kind of in the real early days of low mass cores. And this fella made now I'm getting a twitch in my eye, and I'm wondering if it's our friend Always Learning, because I remember now that I'm having a vague memory that he was from the same part of the world as you, Always Learning. It's been a long time. Anyways, very, very cool building cores with just blanket. It totally works, David. There's some hiccups, the wood loading is an issue. You get caught on the sweater. But otherwise it works just great. Super low mass, real easy to use, really fun. So everyone's getting excited about that. Talking about the ceramic fiber. So let's see. Okay. Yeah, I'm all caught up. So you guys are talking about rigidizing the fiber or the ceramic wool within a structure, and it's going to be awesome. David, I know exactly what core you're talking about, and I can't wait to see it. I think it's going to be really, really neat to see how this thing works out. So, and that's a great way to go. We do know that, like in the 5-minute riser, that's a fantastic way to go, is just line it with wool. No rigidizer even needed. And for some smaller shapes, I don't think rigidizer really is necessary. But of course, David Swanson, if you're lining a 55-gallon drum, then a rigidizer is going to be great. Another thing you can do, David, if you ever get stuck, this is how we attach the insulation in the engine room of an aluminum boat, as it were. But it's really applicable to inside of metal rocket stoves. Is you can tack weld a pin, right? So you could tack weld a nail or a really thin flexible pin, and then you can poke the insulation onto it and fold the top over, or in the case of the professional installations, we use a little pinch cap that pinches on the end of the pin and kind of puts like a looks like a upholstery cap kind of over there. But if you end up sort of wondering how to do that, you could even, if it's a drum, you could even like poke nails through the outside and just tack weld them from the outside or something like that, and then just put your insulation onto those nails and just bend the tips over to hold it, retain it, put a washer on it maybe, and retain it. Anyways, that's one way to another way to retain sort of flexible wool inside a space. Belgian Gulch had a great example on his stove we looked at last weekend. He used some chicken wire in a roof area to hold his wool from falling down. Another great way to do that. So David says 306 stainless screw and washer. You could, yeah. So when you would go from the inside and then poke the insulation onto it and then bend it over, the idea is that the material, the insulation is probably going to protect the metal pin enough that the pin won't spall away to nothing. So it's probably not necessary to use stainless or any really, to use really high, high temperature materials, because the majority of the body is going to be protected inside the insulation. Now, there's a few areas, where that might end up failing, and you might end up needing a little more. But I really think that that you could probably just stick some nails in there and bend them over or something like that. I know it's 306 stainless screw and washer though. If you got them, that's actually probably a better way to go now that I'm thinking about it. And yeah, you could probably even go the other way, couldn't you? You could probably go screw head and washer from the inside and just screw into the body of the drum from the outside. I don't see any reason why you couldn't, that wouldn't work well. And it's going to be all buried in insulation anyways. And then if you do end up with some hair, pinhole leaks, you could always RTV it with your Permatex. Yeah, and screws are easily replaceable. That's a great point, David. Yeah, I think that might be a great way to go. That's actually probably better than what I was talking about with the little pins, because they'd probably lose their grip on the fire facing side. So, well. Anyways, you guys, that's probably enough for today. Really enjoyed all the dialogue today, you guys. Thank you so much for participating and for being here and for making the show what it is. I really appreciate it. So I'll come back next week. We'll do it again. I would like to go over the history a little bit of the stoves. I think there's some interesting stuff there. I learned quite a bit, and I'll maybe spend a little more time and learn a little more. I'd like to get some photos together as well and take a look at what's out there. But let's go over that and whatever else you guys would like to talk about. So gather up your questions, send them to me, send me your photos of your builds. Let me know what you're up to out there. And if you're new, please join us. Please get a build going. Come hang out with us. So Andre says, I plan to do the same thing, but the Rigidizer I got hold of had a minimum of 1 gallon order quantity and shelf life of 6 months. Oh no, Andre, I can totally relate. I have, like I was saying, I have bags of refractory and other things with shelf life that I've let go bad in my shop. So I totally relate. And David Swanson says can't put screws in an aluminum boat hole. And that's exactly right, David. Thank you for appreciating my point of view there. I was totally just thinking about, we're going right to the hole in those engine rooms. And so we're tack welding the fasteners right to the hole. And yeah, we can't screw in from the outside there. So thank you. So, all right, you guys, really appreciate the discussion. Great show today. Thanks for being here. Hope you guys all have a really good week. Get some firewood up. Stack some bricks, and we'll see you guys next week. All right, you guys, I'm going to hit the outgoing video, and hope you guys have a fantastic week. All right, see you guys.